started on the second installment of this on the book of Joshua, and I'll go ahead and hand it over to Steve. And Steve, if you would go ahead and give the timeline, et cetera, I would really appreciate it.
Basically, we're talking about the 13th century BC. I went back to my book that I have. It's called the Timeline Teaching School, because I never wanted to teach without background. Now, I don't have a lot of the leaders because that's not really the significance of the book. The book talks about trends of what's going on and who's happening and what's happening. Like, for example, this is the time when China began to develop their silk industry. We also learned that this is the time when the Trojan Wars actually occurred. That's when the Iliad and the Odyssey were being formulated, I guess. It's the beginning of the Bronze Age. It's the idea of the founding of the city of Corinth. And so you've got that in Turkey, Asia Minor. We were finding that the Hittites were now beginning to mobilize and organize the entire nation of what would become Turkey later on. We also have another empire that's going on, and that's the Greeks. The Greeks are now sending ships out, and so there's a lot of trade that's starting to happen. So the trading wars were going to begin, and people were beginning to move goods from China, India, all the way across over to what would be Europe. It's also the time when Hammurabi was developing his Bible codes, or his version of the codes. Then you had the Persian Empire that was just starting up. You also had the unrest in Egypt, obviously, that was going on, and a rise of a new dynasty called the Amos dynasty. You also had in China the first of their dynasties, the Shang dynasty. So lots of things were happening. Literature-wise, people were developing their alphabets at this point in time. You had the Sumerian alphabet, you had the Semitic alphabet, you had the Hittite cuneiform alphabet, you had the first Chinese literature library was being developed in China. You also had primitive Greek. All of those alphabets were now beginning to be filtered out because you're now dealing with a lot of trade, a lot of economics. In religion, Stonehenge is starting. And you also have, besides that, in Babylon, Marduk is becoming the new god of the Babylonians. So that will become a god that becomes very important when we get into Daniel. And then visually, it's the Bronze Age, which I said, culture, lots of different kinds of things. Crete was developing a decimal system. So mathematics were becoming very, very important. And so there was a lot of things that were going on in the area of mathematics, and the horse trade and all of the other trades were going on. So pretty much a lot of things were happening all over the world. Even Iceland and Finland and Denmark were all creating their own first countries. So there was lots of things going on in Europe. There's lots of things going on all around the area. And so just to give you an idea, little Joshua is now walking into a world that's developing culture.
And at the right time, because now God is getting ready to birth a nation through Joshua's leadership, and the burden is going to be pretty heavy. We're going to discuss why is this going to be pretty much. I just didn't consider how heavy of a burden this was going to be on Joshua until I really started reading in the Midrash what was going on between Hashem and Joshua at the time. Just going back through some of the material from last week, I talked about the book of Joshua is really divided into three sections. Chapters 1 through 12, the conquest of Canaan, the distribution of the land is found in 13 through 22. And then 23 and 24 is the death of Joshua's final farewell speech to the people. Obviously, the book of Joshua has usually been regarded as the completion of the literary unit comprising the first 5 books of the Bible. So you can almost say the first 6 books have attempted to identify Joshua with the same source documents that have been found in preceding books. We understand through a brief history of Joshua, son of Nun. Joshua's wife at this time is getting, or at the future time, will be Rachav from Jericho. Uh, Interesting note, she becomes a convert, but never is mentioned in the Torah itself as a convert. So when a person converts to Judaism, they are not to be reminded of being a convert. This is one of the arguments that we have with the concept of the ger and the gate that we had mentioned earlier, that the ger and the gate is the stranger that lives among you. He's the ger. The ger that converts is a righteous ger, but he's now a Jew. He's no longer a stranger. Joshua, son of Nun, the title character of the book of Joshua, is the son of Nun. We talked about whose figure heavily in the Torah as a protege of Moshe. He was with Moshe at the mountain. As a matter of fact, he became sort of one of the centurions, one of the guards that stood to make sure that no one approached the mountain. I find it interesting that Moshe is not the only one that was put in a basket in the water. Joshua, son of Nun, was also put in a basket in water to help save his life. He had an important role, of course, with the 12 spies, Canaan in the land of Canaan, and only one of the two came back with positive. Only two came back with good positive results. Um, the conquest of the book of Joshua is going to be giving us an extremely optimistic view. Now, one of the reasons why they say that Joshua carries out such a positive review is when the book of Joshua was penned at the time of what they say or believed was the time of the exile, that the person that penned this wanted to show how faithful God would be to return his people back to the land. The very first story is the famous story sending the spies into Jericho, where the prostitute Rahab, or the madam, whatever you call her, protects them. Once the spies escape the city safely, the Israelites are commanded to move in. Joshua leads the people across the Jordan River in a miraculous parting of the waters, which this was a miracle that was a very powerful thing. And we're going to get into the details of the conquest later on. Then there's allegation of what do you call it? The allocation of the land, and which is an important part. And then we're going to be covering later on, if time permits, some very detailed things that comes out of the Midrash. And so let me do something right now. First of all, let me just say this. When Joshua came to power to be anointed by Moshe, uh, there were very specific words that were given to him from God. Let me turn to my text, if you don't mind. Give me a second here. Naveen. Okay. So the very first five or six words or verses of chapter 1, we're reminded that Moses, my servant, has died and now crossed this Jordan, you and all the nation, to the land in which I give the children. Every place in which the soles of your feet will tread, I have given to you, as I have spoken to Moshe. From this desert and Lebanon to the great river, the Euphrates, and all the land of the Hittites to the great sea westward shall your boundary be. I think I showed the map the other day. Did I show the map? Did I? Yes, yo. Thumbs up if I did. Okay, good. So I did show the map. So here is Hashem reminding Joshua, look, I've got you back. You don't need to worry about anything. Well, let me ask you, why would Joshua be concerned about this in the first place? Why would he be concerned, and why would God have to remind him? there's a couple of very important things that I never really contemplated. What was the difference between Moshe's prophecy and Joshua's prophecy? Can anybody tell me? Just anybody pop in.
Moses did everything correct with God. Visions and dreams were all that Joshua would have had.
Correct. So Moshe heard the voice of God, just like you and I are talking. Joshua instead saw dreams, visions. What would you call uh, metaphoric visions that he would have to figure out what was going on. God was not going to give prophecy to any other person like he gave to Moshe. No other person was going to have that level of prophecy. Number two, the Torah was given directly to Moshe, and Moses knew the Torah front to back. He received the divine download. There was never a time where Moshe did not know what the law said. And it said that Joshua, during the time of mourning, because the people were mourning so heavily for Moshe's death, that they began to forget the Torah. Now, this is what the Midrash says. There were little things that they had forgot to do. And then when the people came to Joshua and asked him what to do, he was like, "Oh, you know what? I have to remember this." Now, the problem is God was starting a new level of maturity for the Jewish people and for their leadership. When Moses was here, they were spoon fed, they were given food, their clothes didn't rot, their clothes grew with them, their shoes grew with them. They were completely an infant stage where God nurtured them all through the wilderness. However, going into the land, Joshua had now has to deliver the people into the land with a whole new paradigm of how they are going to preserve themselves as a people. At this point, they are told, you are responsible for yourself. If you forget the Torah, this is going to be the consequences. Remember the mountain, Mount uh, Gilbo, and help me here. I'm drawing a blank.
Ebal and Gerizim.
Thank you, Gabal and Gerizim. They had a decision. Here, remember the Torah. This is what happened. You don't remember. You don't do it. This is what's going to happen. Very, very stark reality for Joshua is that all of a sudden I'm going to take the people in, and we do not have the level of divine connection that we used to have with God through Moshe. Moshe had a divine connection, and that when we get into the land, we are moving into a physicality that we didn't experience in the wilderness. I could almost take it on the same level of whenever we are born into our physical bodies. We go through a gestation period in the womb, and our mother feeds us, makes sure that we're taken care of in the womb, and then we are birthed into a reality that is rather shocking. As a matter of fact, I think that if we understood how shocking it was for a child, we might not think about having children. Because could you imagine being in this embryonic fluid, and you're at perfect temperature at all times? You always have food, you have nurture. You hear the voice of your mother, you recognize sounds in the womb, and then when you come out, all of a sudden you're in physicality. You have to breathe, you have to eat, you have to stay warm, and if you don't have a mother to do that for you, you will die. You'll die out on the table somewhere. So the children of Israel are now going into the land. They don't have their spiritual leader, Moshe, though they do trust Joshua. They were very upset that he forgot his Torah, was very upset with him. However, nothing was done because he was at such a high level that they knew something something was really afoot for him at that high level not to remember it. But there was a reason behind what God was doing. And this is where I scratch my head. Why would God send Joshua, that's a level lower than Moshe, that's going to have to fight? You hear me? Now think about this. He and the people are going to have to fight for every letter of the Torah to remember it. Not like Moshe, who got this instant download. It was on his hard drive. He didn't have to remember it. It was there. And yet he's going to send his people on a new venture to be occupying the land that God has given, and they have to struggle to keep it. You would think it would be backwards, right? You would think God takes them out of Egypt, brings them through the wilderness. It's tough. Yes, he takes care, but when he gets to the land, it flows with milk and honey. There are grapes that drip wine in your mouth as you walk through, eggs as big as chickens, whatever they're going to do. You would think that's what God's going to do. No, instead, you go to physicality and now you start your work. And it's very much like our own personal lives when we're born. We're born into this world. We come into our personal life. All of a sudden, we have air in our lungs. We scream out. Now we feel hunger like we've never felt before. We feel cold. We feel hot. We need to be protected from the elements. And yet we're out there on our own. Joshua says, and that any person like Joshua, and especially Moshe, the higher you get, the more you fight against the Yetzer. Have you guys heard this? That the higher level of a tzaddik has to fight against their Yetzer at a level that we don't have to fight. I would have thought that would have been opposite. I'm thinking if you were a tzaddik, why would you wouldn't struggle, right? A tzaddik, he doesn't struggle because he's figured it out. Well, the problem is that's not how the Yetzer works. The Yetzer works as a buffering tool for a person, and that's what causes the struggle. And then what hit me, like just really hit me, I realized, oh, this has all been designed by the maker. And that is, to reach a level of perfection doesn't mean a lack of struggle. Reaching a level of perfection is, amongst the struggle, how do I react and what do I do? That's huge. Joshua and the people of Israel are going to be tested unlike the people had been in the wilderness. Not even Moses will have experienced the testing that Joshua and them will have during these battles. But you would think, if they're going to be tested this hard, why not give them the best advantage they have? As a matter of fact, it then becomes their own responsibility to remember the Torah. And if they don't, then there's punishment, or what do you call it, consequences for not remembering the Torah. That's bothered me, because I'm thinking, hold on, Hashem. You put these people in possession of their land, and the only thing they had was a promise that you were going to have their back. But other than that, they had to take care of themselves. They had to feed themselves, make sure they follow the proper cycles of planting and sowing, and the Shemitah year and the Jubilee year. That was their job. Now we all know the philosophical idea behind you appreciate what you fight for. You appreciate what you fight for. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why so many veterans during this time are a bit annoyed and upset, because they feel like that the thing that they stood up for and fought for this nation, they're seeing them crumble around them. It's very disconcerting. And when I read about Joshua, here it says in the Torah anthology, God makes some promises to Joshua. We just read a few of those. From this desert, he says, in Lebanon, the great river Euphrates, no man shall stand before you all the days of your life. As I with Moses, so shall I be with you. I will not weaken my grasp on you, nor will I abandon you. Be strong and have courage, for you will cause this nation to inherit the land that I have sworn to their ancestors to give them. Just be strong, very courageous, to observe and to do in accordance with all the Torah and all that Moses, my servant, have commanded you. Do not stray from it right or left in order to succeed wherever you go. The book of the Torah shall not leave your mouth. You shall meditate therein day and night in order that you may observe to do all that is written, for then will you succeed in all your ways. Now, this verse says, this book of the Torah shall not leave your mouth. Is he saying that you will always speak the Torah, or I will cause the Torah to flow out of your mouth? The problem is God has given him the onus. You're going to be the one that has to speak it. You're the one that's going to have to meditate on it day and night in order that you observe to do all that is written within it. For then will you succeed in all your ways, and then you will prosper. It says, did I not command you, be strong and have courage, do not fear and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Here are the facets of God's promises to Joshua. As I was with Moses, so shall I be with you. As God had performed miracles for Moses, so would he do for Joshua. As Moses was victorious over his enemies, so Joshua would be. Joshua was even promised a full 120 years of health and strength, like the life of Moses had been. But for his part, Joshua would have to remain steadfast in his duty to conquer the land. In the following chapters, we will see how this is fulfilled. God gave Joshua the promise to encourage him. The second thing Joshua feared in this whole process was that feared that a prophet would arise and try to challenge him. This is why God said to in verse 5 that no man shall stand before you all the days of your life, meaning you don't need to worry, Joshua, about someone opposing you or a prophet coming to speak against you. He reassured him. God reassured him that Moses was unique among the prophets, so would he be. The one way, however, he would be inferior to Moses, there would never be another prophet like Moses, neither during his lifetime nor after. Moses was the one to whom the Torah was revealed. Even Joshua could never attain this level, but Joshua would be the greatest prophet during his own lifetime, as God assured him, no man will stand. I'll get to the third thing, and that is third thing was the Canaanites, the power that the Canaanites had. Now, go back to this term and this concept of Joshua being a prophet. First of all, what is a prophet? Let's talk about the role and the purpose of a prophet. A prophet is not necessarily someone who sees the future. Okay, that's not what we're talking about. Matter of fact, Nevi'im or Nevi'im really comes from this idea of a preacher of the word of God, right? So someone who goes out and declares the word of God to the people, who expounds on the warnings, the blessings, and the curses of following Torah or not following Torah. That's the role of a prophet. Now, it says there was a warning that if a prophet would come, remember this in the Parsha, if a prophet would come and say anything to declare that is opposite of my Torah, that you ignore him, you have nothing to do with him. There are prophets out there that are like that. There are soothsayers. There are people that are involved in all kinds of dark matter influence who may be at some level of prophetic knowledge. Just because they are not in godly lifestyle doesn't mean that they don't or have not honed the skills of spiritual darkness to be able to do what they do. I think most of the stuff that we see out there is kind of hokey and a joke, but at the same time, there are false prophets and there are real prophets, and we have an acid test of what a real prophet is. Now, Joshua, what was different between he and Moses, as I said earlier, Joshua uh, remembers the conversations and discussions and dialogues he had with Moshe in the tent of meeting in the study tent. But Joshua was not given a divine download, so Joshua had to work on being a scholar of Torah, same as every king after him. Every king had to write 2 Torah scrolls. It was the responsibility of the king to not only follow after the Torah, but to be a scholar himself. And this was going to be one of the jobs that Joshua, as king, was going to have to do. Um, the third thing was the might of the Canaanites, 31 kings with fierce warriors, their soldiers, and therefore God commanded him the promise he had made to Moses, which uh, he said, sent him to Pyro. He said, I will be as I will be. Now, God revealed himself in additional allusions in these holy words, I will be with you. God told Moses, when you stand before Pyro, and so I will be with your disciple Joshua when he goes to fight the kings of the Canaanites. And the fourth thing Joshua feared in going into the land of Israel was his evil inclination. It says that as a person becoming greater, so also the evil inclination. Joshua feared that someday it would become too strong for him to control. It may seem strange that such a holy and righteous person as Joshua was afraid of this. It is something that is very difficult for us who are nowhere near his level of greatness to understand. We cannot imagine how powerful the evil inclination of truly righteous person can be. Now, let me explain this. How many, to include Solomon, David Amalek, and many of the kings of Israel fail after they were in power for some time? Why? Their Yetzer. It got in the way, right? It became part of their struggle. And I think one of the things that we need to be aware of, if we want to draw some 21st century knowledge out of this for ourselves, is the more we progress in the study of Torah and the more we attempt to climb up to higher levels of wisdom, uh, there are issues about our Yetzer we've got to be careful of. Number one is to avoid pride, avoid egotism. It'd be so easy to become prideful, even the slightest aspect. I mean, you remember Daniel when the Babylonian king said, let's make an image to Daniel, and he forbid that. And then they said, let's bow down and worship him. What was Daniel afraid of? Y'all remember? Daniel was afraid that he would immediately go to Gehenna because all idols were to be burned. It said that when Daniel went into the fiery pit, he expected to be consumed by the fire because he was worshiped as a deity. Now, mind you, he wasn't burnt by the fire, which was a testament that that Daniel did not let that affect his Yetzer and did not allow him to develop an ego or pride over the whole thing. I just find that quite interesting. Stand by for a second. Let me get to my notes. um, see, I covered that. Yeah, let's look at some parallels between Joshua's life and death. The book of Joshua contains many similar stories to the story of Moses. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was Ross, our great resident scholar, who pointed out, or maybe Sandy, you can tell me who, and then if after you guys can fight, ever who was the most knowledgeable. said that there are parallels between Joseph and Joshua. Who said that? Da, 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 da. Y'all don't remember? Man, if the old man can remember, we have trouble. Joseph brought Israel into Egypt. Joshua brings them into the promised land. See the two? So we're going to have some parallels. We're going to draw a few of these, and it should be interesting. Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt. Joshua leads them into Canaan. Moses leads Israelites miraculously across the Red Sea that parts. Joshua leads them miraculously across the Jordan River, which what? Parted. Moses sends out spies into Canaan. Joshua sends out 2 spies into Jericho. Isn't it interesting that Joshua doesn't send 12, but 2? And he sends 2 of the most trusted individuals. Who were they? Phinehas and Caleb. 2 absolute heroes of the Jewish people, right? Absolutely dependable. The most powerful men full of integrity. Now, it says Moses allocates land on the east side of the Jordan. Joshua allocates lands on the west side of the Jordan. And finally, Moses gives a prolonged address before dying, as does Joshua. This farewell address at the end of the book brings the parallelism between the 2 leaders full circle. Of course, we have found out that Joshua dies at 110 years old. Only one patriarchal figure actually lived exactly 110 years old. And who was it? Joseph. Ding, 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 ding. You won. You won a $5 cup of coffee from Starbucks. The book of Joshua connects the 2 leaders in the final lines of the book. After Joshua has already passed away, we find this. The bones of Joseph, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried in Shechem. Joseph was responsible for bringing the Israelites down to Egypt, but Joshua was led the people back to the Canaan, officially ending the exile and opening a new chapter Israelite history in which the people inherit their homeland. Coming on the heels of this is the birth of many nations, as Steve brought up, the fact that Finland and these Slavic countries were starting to develop into forms of government, and you have you have the Greeks that are building up power. You have the Hittites, which the Hittite kingdom became a very powerful kingdom. I think the Greek and the Hittites ended up, battling it out quite a bit. And we'll read later on in the text about the Hittites and how they played in the life of the nation of Israel. Let's see. Excellent. I can't believe I covered everything with no problem. Let's see if I've got one more thing. Okay, that's about it without being redundant. Anyway, let's go ahead and open up the floor for discussion and comments or what you've been studying. Next week, we're going to move into the third part, which is going to start analyzing the text. And once we get into analyzing the text, we're going to start in the next chapter, which would be chapter 2. Okay, who's first? If you just unmute your mic, you can go.